The Victorian period is seemingly straightforward in its timescale, in that it is directly tied to the reign of Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837 and died in 1902. So it also means that it covers the second half of the 18th century and a little bit of the first half of the century. Also, this was from the perspective of England, of the UK, this was a period of peace and stability. In fact, people sometimes referred to the Pax Britannica, a 100 years of relative peace and stability. This is between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the beginning of the First World War. But as we will see a little bit later, this doesn't mean that England wasn't involved in wars. On the contrary, there were quite a few. They just didn't happen in England, and they were not European continental wars. So people experience this as a period of stability and also prosperity. But we should nevertheless be wary of seeing the whole period of Victorianism as homogeneous, as the same. This is a long stretch of time, and it's not only that, but it's a time in which things change drastically and quite quickly. Mark Twain in 1897 visited London during the Diamond Jubilee celebrations honoring the 60th anniversary of Queen Victoria's coming to the throne. That was very much at the end of the Victorian period. And as an outside observer, he said this: British history is 2,000 years old, and yet, in a good many ways, the world has moved farther ahead since the Queen was born than it moved in all the rest of the 2,000 put together. So Twain's comment captures really the sense of dizzying change that also characterizes the Victorian period. The fact that nothing stays the same and things change at a really breathtaking pace. Among these changes, there was a large population growth. There was colonialism and imperialism. The Victorian period is the height of the extent of imperialism, and also, of course, there is the rapid industrialization that happens in the country, that is shown, for example, by the spread of railways, steamships, but also, of course, factories and so on, as we'll see. And last but not least, a large progress in the sciences. And we'll talk a little bit more about Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species as sort of a symbol of how science not only sort of quietly worked in the background, but really fundamentally influenced and shaped the way that people regarded the world. Here's another contemporary indication of how people thought that things had changed over the course of the year. So this is again from the end of the Victorian period, where you see these double images, and they're juxtaposing so the then and now. So then you had the sailing boats. Now you have steamships. Then you had the horse-drawn carriage, and now you have the railway. Then you had the dark city streets that were illuminated only by these gas lamps, and now, of course, you have electricity and electric lights. So the sense of change is really something that already contemporaries were aware of. And of course, you see all these heads of the eminent Victorians who made all of this possible. And one thing that you might notice is that these are all men. So we will talk about this, of course, and see how, in many respects, the Victorian period is also one in maybe the last time that sort of the patriarchy really asserted itself as an absolute, unquestioned or questioned force. But Victoria isn't just coincidental as a name giver. It's not just because she happens to be queen at the time. There's a lot of symbolic value also attached and significance attached to Queen Victoria. A lot of that has to do with the relative unpopularity of her predecessor, and that was George the Fourth. In in the previous video, I talked a little bit about the periodization of Jane Austen, who was often not regarded as a romantic writer. Very often you will find her referred to as a Regency writer, and that's because George IV at the time was acting as Prince Regent, so he wasn't yet king, because King George III, his father, was still living, although he was mad. Remember how Shelley in England in 1819 began with an old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king. He was actually mad, certified mad, so that his sons had to step in. But he wasn't king, so we had sort of this in-between role, and that apparently wasn't very good for him, for his personal development. So he was seen as immoral, and because of that, he was highly unpopular. He had a known bad relation with his father, but also with his wife, and he had a very dissolute way of life, which earned him the contempt of the people and really dimmed the prestige of the monarchy. Now, even in an official portrait, you can see that they're doing their best to make him appear stately, but he seemed to have had an eating problem, as you see in an unofficial caricature of the time. So this was how people saw him, as this profligate, lazy, immoral person, and taxpayers became really angry at his wasteful spending, particularly in times of war. When he did not provide national leadership in these crises, he didn't act as a role model for his people. His ministers found his behavior selfish, unreliable, and irresponsible. And that really sort of took the prestige of the monarchy down a notch. And it is characteristically one of the things that Victoria does, is that she stands for the monarchy regaining prestige, but by stepping away from this idea of absolutist and finally corrupt power. And in fact, Queen Victoria, through her reign, presided over developments in the political system that shifted power away from the monarchy and also from the aristocracy, more towards a democratic system. So this is really when constitutional monarchy is gradually established in England. Reforms of the voting system increased the power of the House of Commons at the expense of the House of Lords and of the monarchs. And if you know anything about England, you know that the House of Lords is still there, the monarch is still there, but their role is largely symbolic, and all the power is really in the House of Commons. And this shift is something that is accelerated in this time. You might remember that we said one of the points where Romanticism ends is in 1832 with these reform bills, which started to change the electoral system in England, and that in itself brought political changes with it, and that's something that carries on into the Victorian period as well. So as the role of the monarchy shifts from real political power to more symbolic power, there is this emphasis on morality, on values, as a contrast to the predecessors in the Georges. So there's an emphasis on family values, in contrast to the scandals, sexual scandals, financial and personal. And Victoria really becomes sort of this family monarch, with which the middle class, which really asserted its position at this time, could identify. And you see images like this one here, where the monarch isn't presented. I mean, contrast this to portraits of Elizabeth I, who presents herself as the symbol of power. Here we really see a symbolic image of a family. Now, how do the ideas about art and literature of the Victorians differ from those of the Romantics who went before them? Well, for all the great poetry and art that was produced by the Romantic generations, many 19th century readers and writers believed that their approach, the Romantic approach, had tended towards an excess of subjectivity, which in itself was basically egotistic. They're taking the subjective to the absolute, meant that they would negate, basically, in a way, society. So Victorians saw this as excessive, and as a sort of a one-way street to go into absolute individuality in which there is no other that you can relate to. So in a way, they wanted to go back to the more socially oriented writing of the 18th century, of classicism. Also, this focus on pure subjectivity meant that, of course, objectivity falls out, and they wanted to return to that. But then the interesting thing is, of course, that you can't just turn back the clock. Victorians had already passed a great divide, one of the central ones in Western intellectual and social history, and they could not return merely to the elegant wit and the scathing satire of the Augustans as if nothing had happened. So the Victorian project really involved finding a literary and artistic means of bridging a series of binary oppositions that they saw. Opposition between the self and the society. Now, you couldn't just go back to analyzing society as if the self didn't matter, because the self had been brought to the table and had asserted itself. The political and the personal, as we saw these shifts between something like social satire of Pope, and the hyper personal of the sentimental of a Richardson or a Mackenzie. And also between the subjective and the objective. While they would not believe that everything is purely subjective, they could also not ignore that subjectivity played a role. So the Victorians had to find a way to create a synthesis between this, and also between what we might call pragmatic and expressive forms of art. There's another thing. You remember one of the great shifts was that the didacticism that had always been at the center of understandings of literature before Romanticism was supplanted by this idea that art is really just there for its own sake. So the pragmatic is the form of art is one that has a purpose, that is for something, whereas the expressive form is for itself. So how do you combine these? How do you get out of this, again, one-way street of seeing art only for itself, but yet do not return to merely art being subservient to some kind of teaching purpose? So Victorian literature attempts bravely and often successfully to combine individuality, originality, intensity, and above all, the sincerity of writers like Wordsworth and Keats, with public accessibility and the social relevance of writers like Pope and Johnson. So to write something that is as authentic, as true, as personally valid as the Romantic writing, but that is yet speaking to a broader range of people, and that is accessible, and that is socially relevant for our time. And this might already be the explanation why the one genre, as we will see, that comes to dominate Victorian literature particularly is the novel. Because the novel, in an ideal way, combines these binary oppositions. It combines the personal and the individual through characters and through narrative perspective, as we saw. You can focus on the personal and the individual, but it combines that with the social, because you can not only tell the story of one character, but you can tell the story of many characters. And these characters can come from all different stations of life, and you can combine them to a social portrait. It is concerned with the here and the now, and therefore it is easy to include social commentary, as opposed to in the Romance form, in the Gothic Romance form, where you set the story back then, and you talk about the here and now only in sort of symbolic ways, as the radical Gothic novels of the 1790s did. So you can talk about the here and now, and you can make statements about the social. And it also contextualizes the private within the social, which is a change of focus from the sentimental, and it is a form that is highly accessible. It's not something where you need to have a lot of learning, where you need to understand all of the allusions. Particularly if you were a reader at the time, you could just open up any of those books and read it and understand it. And still today, the Victorian novel is highly accessible in a way that Victorian satire isn't. I try to talk a little bit about that, how there's this great satire, and it's funny as hell if you get it, if you understand, if you have the background, and the background could be classical allusions and contemporary culture and society and so on. So with these novels, you can just start describing a scene, describing characters, and everything else emerges out of that. So you can basically open up any Victorian novel and read it and enjoy it, and whatever it wants to transport will just be delivered along the enjoyment of the reading. The guiding philosophy that goes along with this refocus on the social and the useful and the pragmatic is utilitarianism, a philosophy that fits into this notion of pragmatic responsibility. Utilitarianism is a theory in normative ethics, holding that the proper cause of action is the one that maximizes utility, specifically defined as maximizing happiness and reducing suffering. So it's a moral philosophy that looks particularly at the outcome of an event or an action. Any decision is judged by what kind of consequences it has, and if it maximizes happiness, then that is necessarily good. So according to utilitarianism, the moral worth of an action is determined only by its outcome. Influential contributors to this theory were Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. In a fragment on government, Bentham said, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." And this he describes this as the sort of the fundamental axiom of utilitarianism. And this, of course, differentiates it from other ethical systems, from rationalism, for example, which had attempted to search for absolute moral truth and absolute moral laws and try to rationally and logically prove them. And as that proved itself to be difficult, sentimentalism stepped in with this concentration on the moral sense, on our knowledge or on our intuitive knowledge that an action is bad or good, which had sort of reflected much more on the personal and on what kind of character we are. And here we are looking at the outcome, and that's very characteristic of the Victorian age, this sort of pragmatic, subsuming everything under its pragmatic function. Another major development, as we've already said, was, of course, the Industrial Revolution. Now, this isn't the course on social and cultural history of Great Britain, so I will not say a lot about this. But we experience a shift away from a life based on ownership of land to a modern urban economy that was based on trade and on manufacturing. The Industrial Revolution substitutes machines for hand labor that began with a set of inventions for spinning and weaving that were developed in England already in the 18th century. And these were first operated by workers in their own homes, but in the 1780s, the introduction of the steam engine to drive the machines led manufacturers to install them in large buildings, buildings that were first called mills and later factories. And this created profound economic and social changes because this concentration of work away from the home, from the individual home to these places meant that there was mass migration of workers to these places where there was work, to industrial towns where they now lived in newly emerging places that were basically slums. The so-called mill towns, factory towns, quickly grew in central and in northern England. The population of the city of Manchester, for example, increased by 10 times in the years between 1760 and 1830. So a tenfold increase in people. And these workers famously worked under very, very poor working conditions. One of those was low wages, but also very long working hours. 14 hours and more would be sort of normal working hours. And most outrageously, child labor. That actually became one of the the early points for social critique and for social reform connected with the Industrial Revolution. Child labor was often a symptom of economic hardship, that people just had to send their children to work in order to make enough money to live. But it was also, of course, a symbol for how this newly emerging capitalist industrial system exploited the most vulnerable, and it was partly because employers like to employ children and also women because they would work for even less. You needed to pay them less money, so it was actually profitable to employ children. And we already saw sort of the beginning of the critique of child labor in poems like William Blake's The Chimney Sweepers, but this became sort of an even more urgent problem for writers of the time. Charles Dickens himself, the novelist, worked at the age of 12 in a blacking factory when his family was in debtor's prison, when they were in prison because they had no money. So what we're seeing are numerous reactions against this. One of them, of course, coming from Dickens himself, his novel Oliver Twist of 1838, an early example of the social novel. The book calls the public's attention to various contemporary evils, including the poor law and child's labor, but also the recruitment of children as criminal and the presence of street children. Dickens mocks the hypocrisies of his time by surrounding the novel's serious themes with sarcasm and dark humor. But at the center there's this child character, Oliver, who is sort of forced into this system, and that, of course, the child as sort of the innocent victim of the circumstances becomes the symbol for how the circumstances are wrong and the system is wrong and needs to be reformed. And in fact, the Victorian period is also the period where writers started to reflect on these situations, to criticize these situations. In a non-fiction way. This is the emergence, of course, of socialist and communist theory. Friedrich Engels, in fact, went to Manchester for 20 months in order to observe the industrial conditions there, because that was sort of the ground zero of industrialization. And he comes back writing The Condition of the Working Class in 1845, a book that prepares the ground for his work then with Karl Marx together to write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. So we see how the situation is also the germ of sort of a revolutionary attempt to change this system. Most of the writers, the Victorian writers, as we'll see, are not revolutionary in the same way, but they do want to address these problems, although more in a reformist way than in a revolutionary way. So, for example, novels like Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton of 1848. That was inspired by the wish to portray the suffering of the working class, and then later works by Dickens as well. Hard Times is sort of often seen as the industrial novel, where he creates the fictional city of Coketown to depict the harshness of existence in the industrial towns of central and northern England. But particularly the struggle against child labor brought with it also a renewed focus on childhood. Sometimes it is said that the Victorians really invented childhood, in the sense that they conceptualized it as something that was distinct from adulthood. And the fight against child labor is a very important part of that. In that we can't send these people to work because they're not yet grown up, and they need to develop in a certain way. So this is, of course, has its sources in the romantic notion of the innocence of the child that we see in works like by Wordsworth and Blake, for example. But here it becomes sort of a broader notion of a specific developmental phase in humans' lives that is special, and that these people are special. So the work against child labor is one part of it, and the other is the introduction of compulsory education, so that instead of working, these children should actually go to school and learn something. In 1840, only about 20% of the children in London had any schooling. So only 20% did go to any kind of school. But by 1860, about half of the children between 5 and 15 were in school. That includes Sunday school. So we see this shift that suddenly a much broader range of children would actually be sent to school. Now, of course, as children began to be able to read, they wanted to read, they will want to read, and then literature for young people becomes a growth industry. So if the Victorians didn't really invent childhood, they at least invented children's literature. And this is really the beginning of a tradition of writing directly for children that has created some of the great works of children's literature. Writers like Lewis Carroll, Aaron Ballantyne, Anna Sewell wrote mainly for children, although they had also adult followings. And this is where works like Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are created. The Coral Island by Ballantyne, or Black Beauty by Anna Sewell, which you might still know from the TV series that was created much later. But also Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, made famous by the Disney version, and some writers who wrote for adults nevertheless wrote books that would appeal to young readers, like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, sort of quintessential adventure and pirate book. And then there were other genres like nonsense verse like the poetry of Edward Lear, that would appeal to childlike interests in nonsense and things like that. So this is really where a lot of the archetypes of children's literature come from.